Hey folks, I'm Chuck Black. We're doing 52 weeks of Python in 10-minute sessions. Today's topic is CSV. That is taking CSV data that looks something like this and converting it into, by default, list of lists. There's also capabilities to do it into a list of dictionaries. We don't use these functions in this lesson. In the long form of this tutorial, then you can find more about that, but we do create a list of dictionaries manually, and that's some interesting Python code that I encourage you to learn and understand. That's what we'll be doing, CSV stuff. Let's get started. So let's talk a little bit about CSV translation into Python. So what you're looking at here is CSV type data. Now the first line is optional. That represents what you might think of in a spreadsheet as the headers for the columns. You might also think of them as keys in some type of data structure as well. And then the last two lines are the actual data. So the first thing being the name, the second being the host name, the third being the SSH port, etc. And so what we're looking at in terms of code here is how do you translate that either into the way it translates naturally in stuff that I've worked with, which is into lists of lists, as you see Python data here. But if you do have that topmost line, then you can translate it into Python data that looks like this, which is probably more like we would want to deal with it, which is a list of dictionaries. And in each dictionary, you have the key, which is, in this situation, the column heading. And so you see name, host name, SSH port, etc. for the devices. So the whole thing is a list of items, and each item is a dictionary. And so now we'll look at the code that allows this to happen. So before we look at the code, let's look at this picture right here because it shows what's going to go on. We are going to use a CSV reader and a writer to go from CSV format into the Python data structure, which is going to be a list of lists. If we want to go into a list of dictionaries, then we are going to be using CSV dict reader and CSV dict writer. That's what we'll be using in the code. Now we'll look at the code. So let's look at this code in detail. So what we're going to do first is we're going to import from our same inventory file. This time we have separate data that is created just for this purpose, called CSV inventory. CSV inventory, as you can see, is a list of lists, and I've done the special thing here where the very first list in this list is actually the headers for the columns. So this is the headers which identifies effectively that the first item here is name, the second item here is host name, the third item is SSH port. None of our code knows anything about that. We have to write code that will make use of that, but that is what the data is that we are reading in. And once again, what we're going to do is we're going to write this out, and then we're going to read it back in. And this is how you do it with CSV. What we end up doing here for writing, as I'm opening the file, once again, just like we did before, but what we need to do first is we need to say, I want to create something called a CSV writer, and I'm giving it the name CSV writer. It could be called anything you want. That's just a variable name, but I need to pass in the file name to which we are going to be writing it. Once I have this writer that is a CSV.writer type of object, I can use that object to perform a function called write rows. What it will do is it will take this CVS inventory thing. Remember, that is my list of lists, this whole thing. It's going to take that and it is going to write it out one line at a time. So the end result will be a file which has items in it that is in a CSV format, which is going to look something like what you see right up here at the top. So it's going to write that out. The next thing that we're going to do, and this is again just like we've done before, is we're going to read it back in. And so I'm going to open that file that I just wrote out, and I'm opening it for reading. And what I'm going to do now, this is similar to what I did above, except this time I'm creating a CSV reader. Before I created a writer, this time I'm creating a reader. Again, I can give it any variable name that I want. I'm calling it CSV reader. And what I'm going to do in order to read from that CSV file is I'm going to use a for loop, and I am going to iterate through them one line at a time. And for every line, I'm going to call the line device. Now, if you look at my file here, you can say, well, this line is a device. The second one and the third one is a device. The first one is a heading. I just noticed that. Please forgive the fact I perhaps should have named this something else, maybe line. For line in CSV Reader, I am going to append it to my saved CSV inventory. And then I print it out, but the thing that is important is because I have the original right here, and this is the one that I wrote out and I read back in, and I'm comparing to see if they're equal. So CSV Writer, you create it, and then you do write rows. CSV Reader, you create it, and then you can iterate through it in order to read successive lines from that file. So here we're looking at the output. This is my CSV pretty version. As you can see, I'm just printing out what I have written out and then read back in and stored it in saved CSV inventory. And as you can see, it looks like this Python data, which is what inventory looked like before. So you shouldn't be surprised that when we did the comparison, they're both equal. Now the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to go through that data that we read in and create a list of dictionaries rather than having it be a list of lists, because a list of lists is going to be of marginal value. As you recall, you kind of need to know what each of these things is. So here is my output. This is what our goal is. We want it to be we want it to be a list of dictionary items. This is the first device, and the next one is the second. How do we do that? Well, that's what this code does that I've highlighted. So we're going to take a minute to look through this. Now, this is not using dict writer or dict reader. This is doing it manually. If you want more information about the other ways to do it, you can look at the long form version of this. But let's look at this code. First, I say my devices is going to be a list. This is where I'm going to put everything. Now the next thing I do is I have a for loop where I'm going through the length of the things in my inventory. So I'm basically going to go through the outer list, starting at 1 and then going to the length of that, which is going to be 2. And what I'm going to do within this for loop is I'm going to create a dictionary, and then within that dictionary I'm going to go through first, ignore enumerate for a while. That's just giving me the index. I'm basically going to iterate through CSV inventory 0. What is CSV inventory 0? CSV inventory 0 is this thing right here. So this is basically the names of the columns. So I'm iterating through the names of the columns, and what I'm going to do here, and you're going to have to put your thinking caps on, is I'm going to go through the names of the columns, and then I'm going to say for every name of a column, I'm going to say device. So this is a dictionary, and the header. So the first time the header is going to be the string name. The second time through, the key is going to be the host name. The third time through, it's going to be SSH port. And what I'm doing, the value that I'm setting it to is coming from my device inventory. I'm pointing at a particular device. That's from my outer loop. Remember, I'm going to be doing it for device number 1 and then device number 2. And then the index is the item within here that I'm referencing. So when I'm referencing name, it will be getting the first item. When I'm referencing host name in the inner loop, it will be referencing this thing. Okay, so this is some pretty complicated, not really complicated, but you just have to have your Python brain on to figure out what's happening. At the end of this for loop, I have a device which has a name, host name, SSH port, username, and password as keys for my dictionary, and then I'm going to append it to my devices list. And at the end of the day, I'm going to have my devices list, and that is what this looks like. So let's review. CSV files have a list of comma-separated values, and optionally you can have the headings of each column effectively in the file as well. You can go into a list of lists, which is what happens with the normal reader and writer. There's also functionality to do dictionaries. We did it ourselves manually, but there is a dict writer and a dict reader, as you can see right here. So how does the code work? The way that the code works is we create a CSV writer, and then we use that to write rows to write stuff out. We create a reader to read stuff in, and then we read it in by iterating through our reader one line at a time. And then we end up with a list of lists, and we saw how that equals the original. Then we looked quickly at this piece of code, which has 2 for loops, which is good practice for your Python capabilities and understanding of stuff. So I strongly encourage you to look at this and make sure that you understand it. But that's how I turned this list of lists into a list of dictionaries. Hopefully that made sense. If not, let me know. And as always, thanks for listening.